Okay, Nathan Smith, Economics and Business. We're continuing Chapter 8 from a previous video. And so we were just looking at long-run average cost curve. Now, we want to think about estimation of cost functions. And one example here, we're going to assume a particular kind of cost function, and then we're going to think about how it would be estimated. And again, the background here is that you have some concept of regression analysis and functional forms. So the cost function is Q equals C equals, average cost of unit Q equals C equals A Q to the B. What's that B? The B is some kind of an exponent. So, so the idea is that the average cost of unit Q depends on Q, depends on how many units in you are, so to speak. And so depending on what B is, average cost might be rising or falling. If you look at the chart, it seems like it's falling. So this B is something less than 1. So, and now you note that it isn't linear here. So remember, if you're conducting regression analysis, you always have to look for the regression line. You always have to estimate a linear function, but in this case, the function doesn't have that form. So what you need to do is take logs, and it turns out it does have in terms of logs, the function is linear, and so then you could run a regression. Take logs of C, log of A, log of each side. This side you get log C. This side, you get log A plus log Q times B. So the exponent becomes a coefficient in that estimation, and so then you could estimate costs. In general, then costs are not necessarily given. They're not self-evident. You might have to try to deduce them from looking at your company's data. And so that's one reason why you might have a cost curve like this in mind and think about how to estimate it. Stepping away from the mathematical models for a moment, what's going on in general with cost? What kinds of things do managers need to think about if you're trying to minimize costs internationally? A lot of times you might want to get goods from foreign sources. So often foreign sources will be able to supply inputs cheaper. Possibly they can supply them with higher quality. Economies of scale, we've talked about some. This is an important concept in managerial economics. A lot of times you can get lower costs if you're operating at a larger scale, and this is now true at an international level. So maybe if you're exporting a lot, or if you're importing inputs from abroad, then those will basically be produced on a larger scale. You can operate on a larger scale. You can lower your costs. Another important phenomenon. Well, many types of workers are in short supply in the United States, and programmers, chemists, certain types of scientists, doctors actually. And you might want to recruit abroad. Of course, then you have to deal with government bureaucracies to help these people come. Maybe they have their own way of coming, but a lot of skilled labor comes from abroad. This is sometimes called brain drain in the sense that it's actually, I find that term a little bit offensive, but it's often used. It means that some of the smartest people may be leaving developing countries and then moving to rich countries instead. But brain drain has sort of negative connotations, and there's nothing wrong with those people coming here. But I guess it rhymes. So logistics. This is an important part of cost. It's an important part in general of profit maximization and of optimizing production processes, production and distribution processes. I mean, logistics per se is not about production. Logistics is about just moving things around. But how you make your production decisions will depend on your logistics decisions as well. So if you're able to move stuff around really efficiently, then you might be able to choose where to produce stuff where your costs are lowest. Whereas if you can't move stuff around as efficiency, you might have to sort of produce everything in the same place. Maybe you even have to produce it where you sell it, which may not be the best place to produce it. And obviously this depends a lot on the good. But parts of logistics, purchasing, where do you buy goods from? After you've bought them, you might have to transport them, you might have to store them in warehouses, you ultimately have to distribute them to retailers or directly to customers, or it depends on your business, and then you have to provide customer service afterwards. And this can be a source of competitive advantage against other firms if you can deliver products faster, or if you can, through skillful supply chain management, this art is all sort of called supply chain management, figuring out where you source stuff. If you're good at supply chain management, then you can source stuff from the cheapest places, and that might give you a price advantage over your competitors. So logistics has become more important probably in the last 3 decades or so. Part of this is driven by computer technology, so it's a lot easier to solve complicated problems. If we need to get X to Detroit at the same time that Y gets to Detroit, so we can put them together. We don't want them to be sitting in warehouses because that wastes money, and well, that can become very, very complicated problems, and so computers help people to solve those. Something called just-in-time inventory management is something to be aware of. This, I think, sort of emanated from Japan and then was widely imitated elsewhere. And the idea is you don't have a lot of inventory on hand. The goods, the inputs to your production process arrive just when you need them. This also might give you more flexibility. So suppose that you introduce a new product, or you decide to make a small modification in a product. And well, if you have lots of inventories on hand from your previous, you have lots of parts that were designed for the previous production process just sitting around, well, you don't really want to throw those away, so maybe it takes a while before you can introduce the new product, whereas if you're doing things in this just-in-time fashion, you don't have a lot of extra inventory sitting around, you can be much more flexible. And maybe if you realize, wait a minute, this product would be more popular if we did such and such, you can respond quickly to what you see is going on in the market. If a competitor introduces a new product and you want to compete with that, you can adapt quickly and minimize the time your competitor has to get goodwill by being the only one on the market with this particular feature. So just-in-time inventory management has become an important part of business, and globalization of production and distribution. Again, if you look at all sorts of things that you buy, often they'll be made abroad. They might be made in China. They might be made in a lot of different countries. East Asia is important here. Sometimes the same product will have components from 6 or 7 different countries because some corporation is figuring where's the best place to make X, where's the best place to make Y, where's the best place to make Z, and the product may move around through several different countries in the process of being produced. So those are some things to bear in mind. Now, which again, we don't really have them in the mathematical models, so we can. It's often easy to verbally speak about things, which it's not so easy to put in abstract frameworks. But okay, so. Now, if we want to think about profits, we want to combine the cost analysis that we've done with thinking also about revenue. So we have total revenue, P times Q, we knew that already. Total cost, and here we split it up into total fixed cost plus the average variable cost times Q. So this is total variable cost together. Now, break-even volume is some quantity which will set total revenue equal to total cost. So typically costs are going to stay the same or rise. They may fall a little bit. Total revenue is eventually going to stop rising so much because you may be facing a downward sloping demand curve. So either cost slopes up or revenue slopes down. Either way, you'll get some kind of a break-even volume, which is the optimal level to produce at. So if we just do a little bit of algebra here, we take this PQ, then we take this TFC plus total variable cost. We set those equal to each other, and we want to solve for this Q. So how do we do that? Well, it looks like let's see, a little bit of algebra. So PQ equals average variable cost. You would put these on the same side, and then you divide by the P minus average variable cost. You end up with this expression. And so that's the optimal, the break-even volume. So, sorry, it's not optimal necessarily. It's the break-even volume. So that's basically how much you have to sell in order to cover your costs. So, and notice that in this case, I was suggesting you could be facing a downward sloping demand curve, but that's actually not what's being taken into account here. Here we're assuming that that the price is constant. Price isn't a function of Q, it's just multiplied by Q. There's some fixed price. So if you're facing a fixed price, but you have some fixed, if you're facing a market price, you're a price-taking firm, you have some fixed costs, there will be some volume that you have to sell in order to break even. And if you don't sell it, you lose money. And if you do sell it, and you keep selling more after that, that's when you start to make profits. So this represents it graphically. Notice total cost, linear. So again, we're simplifying things a little bit. We're assuming that average variable cost is constant. We're assuming that price is constant. So total revenue is just an upward sloping curve starting at 0, starting at the origin. And then total cost starts a little ways up the y-axis here, or the dollars axis, at 200, because this is fixed cost. But then average variable cost is lower than the price, so if you can manage to sell B, then you've covered all your costs. If you can't, you take a loss. If you do, then you start making a profit. So another concept you can think about is operating leverage. Total fixed cost divided by total variable cost. And so you can think about what this would mean if this was really high or if it was really low. In the example here, total fixed cost is 200, total variable cost is 200. If you're at B, operating leverage would be 1, because those are the same thing. And this degree of operating leverage is just a variation on the same concept. So this tells you you could say the elasticity of your profits with respect to your quantity sold. So so you can imagine firms might be in different situations. If you have really high fixed costs but really low variable costs, then you would have a high degree of operating leverage. And so then your profits would be particularly sensitive to the quantity that you sell. You've got a lot of fixed costs to cover, and if you sell a little bit more, you make a lot more profit. You sell a little bit less, you could start taking big losses. Let's suppose your fixed costs are really small. Well, then it doesn't matter so much what scale you sell at. And so this is a concept you can use to think about different firms. Here we can make a comparison. We've got one firm that has total fixed costs of 300, one that has total fixed costs of 200. Seems clearly you'd prefer to be this firm with 200, right? Well, no, actually, because if you notice, the average variable cost is lower for this firm. The average variable cost is higher for this firm. So the gray firm, Prime, has a higher break-even point. They have to sell more in order to break even. And if they get up to 60, and you notice that all through here they have higher total costs. But if they sell a lot, they actually end up with lower total costs. And you can imagine how, as a manager, you might sometimes face this decision. You could say, well, let's see. We could buy another machine. We could buy another computer. It would make our people more productive, but it also raises our fixed costs. So if we get enough business, that will turn out to be worth doing. But if we don't, then we'll lose money because we'll lower our variable cost, but we will have higher fixed costs and it's not going to be worth it. So you have to be able to kind of project how much you're going to sell. Notice this is why it's so important to be able to try to do what we were talking about in the last chapter or in some previous chapters and really estimate what demand is going to look like. Okay. So, empirically estimating costs, this can be tricky. You don't automatically know what your costs are going to be. You'll have some kind of accounting data, and the accounting data won't come in these categories. The accounting data will probably not make it obvious exactly how much you would change your cost by increasing or reducing production. So, the accounting data will only tell you what did happen. It can tell you how much we did produce and how much we did spend, how much our costs were, actual costs and production or sales, but it can't tell you what costs would have been if you'd produced less or if you'd produced more. Just the accounting data won't do that. So you might want to estimate that empirically. So let's say you start with your accounting cost data. First, you have to distribute the costs among products. You're probably making a bunch of different things. Most firms make multiple products, and you have to kind of assign the cost. That could be tricky because you might have a human resources department who deals with all the products simultaneously. You have to distribute those costs somehow. And so that's a challenge. You also need to know how the costs are related to the output. This, again, it might not be super obvious because maybe the output that you sell, it goes on the market 6 months after the costs were incurred. Or maybe the output that you sell this year has taken a year to produce and there's a year's worth of costs that are associated with that. And some types of costs may be investments that spread out over a longer term. Well, some of that will get into capital budgeting, but in any case, even if you're thinking in relatively short term, you have to match costs and output. And then you also have to think about inflation, particularly if you're thinking about over time. If you want to say how much of our costs changed over time, well, you have to correct for inflation. So, okay, so we're going to imagine, let's suppose the total variable costs look like this. Now, this is kind of like the God's eye view. This is what total variable costs are really like. But the manager doesn't get to see this curve. He would love to see it, but he doesn't get to see it. So, from the manager's point of view, we've drawn it in dotted lines because it's sort of invisible. And moreover, range of output observations. Well, guess what? Your company probably never produced this little. So you don't actually know what this would cost. You probably never produced way out here. You don't know what that would cost, at least not based on experience. You might be able to deduce it by extrapolating or some other methods, looking at the engineering or whatever. But in terms of what you actually observe, this is the range. Now, what is this line? Well, this is a regression that's run through here. It's basically you're just doing an OLS regression, you're minimizing the sum of squares, you're just calculating the line that fits this data best. But you notice that it's pretty imperfect because it misses the fact that this line's actually sort of arching up and then, going down a little bit and then sloping back up again. That's all kind of neglected by this line. Now, here's the real marginal cost curve, real average cost curve, average variable cost curve. Now, according to our estimate, well, we've just given this a steady slope, so marginal cost is fixed. Average cost, well, we know it starts down here, so this is our estimate of fixed costs, and then this is our estimate, not a fixed cost, but all of this is talking about variable cost, so we're measuring variable cost. This is our estimated variable cost at 0. And then if we spread the variable costs out over more units, well, what's the best way to put this? It's basically, if you divide each point on here by Q, you end up with this curve. And the curve converges to marginal cost over time. So this is what our estimated cost function looked like, whereas this is the reality. This is not particularly accurate, but it's better than nothing. You probably want to do more sophisticated methods if you can. Here's just some examples. If you're trying to do a linear approximation, maybe the theoretical, even the real total variable cost function here, Q plus Q squared plus Q cubed, there's this coefficient. Well, if you're doing a linear approximation, it has to be linear by assumption, so it's A plus BQ. Same function, average variable cost. Just divide each quantity by Q, we get A plus BQ plus CQ squared. Here, we just divide by Q again. This would be our estimate of average variable cost. And then marginal cost is the derivative of this, and then marginal cost here, again, the derivative of this. So if these are our theoretical forms, these are our linear approximations, well, obviously these are missing something. But they might still be good enough over a short range. And so these are things that you could approximate. Again, the point is, this isn't observable typically for a manager. A manager doesn't know exactly how much it would cost to produce at different scales. So you have to guess, and these are what your guesses might look like. Okay, so thinking about empirical estimation, there's various methods to do this. Regression analysis we talked about already, but what does this cross-sectional mean? It means that you look at a lot of different firms that are in a similar business at a particular time. So an alternative would be time series, but usually the firms can, if you look at how much the firm has produced over a long enough time scales that they're actually varying their scale of production much, then they're also probably changing their mix of product, and input prices are changing, lots of other stuff is changing, so this won't really work. So that's why you look at cross-section, you compare different firms at a given time, and if you have firms that are producing a lot and firms that are producing a little, then you can compare what their costs are, and that tells you something about costs. You could have engineering method. This is where you actually go into the details. You don't just look at accounting data. You actually go in and see, okay, how is this product being made? And how much do all the inputs cost? And including the labor, including skilled labor, supervision, whatever, and obviously raw materials and capital and so on. And then you can try to come up with some estimate in this respect. Obviously, a lot of costs don't have an obvious engineering function. I mean, if people are doing paperwork, that could vary a lot in how much time is spent on that. And that may be related in subtle ways to the quantities that you're producing, but the engineering method isn't really going to tell you that. So this has its pitfalls too, but certainly in some ways it's the most deductive and sort of straightforward and rational in that sense. But it has its faults. Survival technique. This is actually, I won't get into this. This is based on George Stigler's work. It's in the textbook, but I want to finish this up. Okay, so this just gives some examples of small firms versus large firms and how their average costs compare. So what does it mean that this is 129? Well, it means that small firms have larger long-run average costs than large firms do. So there's economies of scale in hospitals. You're more efficient if you're operating at larger scale. Higher education, same thing, not quite to the same extent. Commercial banking, and this depends. Demand deposits, there's a little bit more economies of scale. Electric power, economies of scale. You get down here to trucking, there's actually diseconomies of scale. Small firms tend to have lower long-run average costs. So you can maybe see this. In trucking, it's a fairly simple business in a way. You're just basically taking a truck, packing it with a bunch of stuff, and driving it from point A to point B, and there's no real further gains from from having a bigger truck. Well, those trucks can only be so large, so that's why I think you don't see economies of scale much in trucking. This table is just to drive home how extensive supply chains can be. So this is for Dell PCs. They've got monitors. I don't even remember what that PCBs, what that stands for. But drives, printers, box builds, chassis, all parts of the Dell computer. Where do they get it from? Well, this is pretty general, but they buy it from a bunch of different companies in Europe and Asia. They buy these from Asia, Singapore, from Europe, from Asia and Eastern Europe. This is a Dell computer. Parts are coming from all over the world. So certain European countries are specializing in it. A lot of it's coming from Asia. So this sort of summarizes different surveys that study short-run and long-run cost functions, and these can have different properties. So marginal cost declining, average variable cost declining, marginal cost below average cost at all outputs. So this points to a lot of economies of scale. Manufacturing down here, small economies of scale, many of these have economies of scale. But some other industries, furniture, steel, and hosiery, marginal cost is constant. There may still be economies of scale to some extent, because, of course, you also have fixed costs. You might also have fixed costs. But furniture, not so many economies of scale. And department stores, electricity, falling average variable cost, approaching marginal cost. Notice that, so electricity, here we see diseconomies. At some point you get to diseconomies. Railways, there's a suggestion here, maybe constant returns. Metal, initially economies of scale, then constant. Many of these industries you see economies of scale. So economies of scale are definitely a common phenomenon. And so that's it for Chapter 8.